Hello, everyone, again, and welcome to the Black Podcast Listener Report 2.0. We are ready to get started, and I will now officially hand it over to Gabriel Soto, Senior Director of Research at Edison Research.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your day to join us. I see a lot of familiar names: Priscilla, Demetrius, Talib, Sierra. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that you guys are here. My name is Gabriel Soto. I'm a Senior Director of Research at Edison Research, and we have a big one for you today. On today's webinar, we're going to share some findings from the second edition of the only existing comprehensive study on the Black podcast listening audience. It's called the Black Listener Report 2.0, and we'll dig into some questions. I'm very excited for you guys to see how valuable Black representation is in the podcasting medium. And we're going to see how listenership has changed throughout the years. And we'll also look at how Black listeners feel about podcast ads and what type of shows they're listening to. So if you're watching this live, take a look at your Zoom menu. You should have a chat option and a Q&A option. In the chat window, as many of you are doing already, tell us where you're from, what you do, the name of the podcast that you are repping today, the name of the organization. Tell us what you think about the report in the chat window. If you have a question, open up the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, and that'll guarantee that your question gets answered either by someone behind the scenes or myself or our two experts that we have today. That's right. I'm not doing this alone. Two experts in the podcast industry are here with me. Please give a warm welcome to Nidia Serrano. She is the Vice President of Sales Marketing at SXM Media. And Alexis Reza. She is the Director of Communications and Planning at Mindshare. Welcome to the both of you. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you. I'm excited for this.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Now, Nidia and Alexis, you've both been involved with this study from the very beginning, even before we started interviewing these listeners. What are you most excited for our viewers to learn today?
I mean, for myself, this being the second wave of this report, I'm very excited about the shifts that we have experienced in listening behavior versus the last wave. I think that in 1 year, we've seen tremendous change, not only in the number of users of podcasts and listeners, but also in the behavior. So there's a lot of exciting things that we're going to uncover. Also, this being the second wave, we were very specific and intentional about taking things a step further. We got a lot of great feedback in the conversation last year, and we definitely took that feedback and applied it into the learning. So I'm excited to share all of that with you guys today.
Yeah, and I think from my end, as the comms planner of the group, a lot of what I do for my job revolves around audiences and audience research, really diving deep into media consumption habits. So this just in itself was a really exciting project for me to be a part of, and I'm excited to kind of share some of our new insights.
Awesome. And I'm excited for two things. So I'm excited to have someone who sells ads and another expert who buys ads, who helps on the buying process. You guys, viewers, you guys have an expert who sells, who buys, and a curious researcher, myself, who asks a lot of questions for a living. So please stick around because you do not want to miss what these two amazing people have to say about this report. The second thing I'm excited about is the sweatshirt right here. So at the end of this webinar, we're going to be giving away an Edison sweatshirt. It's a quarter zip. It looks pretty fancy. Once you put this on, you become a very curious person and you become better at asking questions. So stick around. We're going to choose someone at random at the end of the webinar, and we'll announce it to make sure you get your sweatshirt. Stick around, and we'll definitely be able to mail it out to you. So now, Alexis and Nidia, are you ready to get started?
We are.
Okay, awesome. So Viewers, so we want you to understand how we collected the data that you are about to see. So in the third quarter of 2022 in September, we conducted 2,500 online interviews of adults in the United States who identified as Black or African American, the same way we conducted the 2021 podcast listener report. Now, these results were then weighted to match the age, sex, and the region of the US Black population according to the US Census. The podcast listening data, they were weighted to the statistics from our national telephone study, the Infinite Dial 2022. And that was conducted in January of last year. A new Infinite Dial will be updated next week, so stick around for more information on that. Now, it's actually that study, the Infinite Dial, that allows us to size the podcast market in the Black community. So if we start with the basics, how many people listen to podcasts, or how many people are aware of the medium? So if you look on the left, we've probably seen this before. We've added the 2022 numbers. We have the total population. And on the right, that's the US Black population. In 2022, the burgundy colored bar, 81% of Black Americans are familiar with the term podcasting. And that's not too different from the US population, but there is a difference in consumption. In 2022, 38% of adults in the US listened to a podcast in the last month, while that rate is slightly higher among the Black population at 43%. Listenership among Black Americans increased by 7 points since 2021 and 9 points since 2020. In contrast, Nidia, monthly podcast listening among the total population, that actually decreased since 2021. What do you think accounts for the difference?
Yeah, there was an interesting insight that your team brought during the last, when you shared the Infinite Dial, and it was the fact that listenership amongst the total population pretty much spiked during the pandemic. And then after, we kind of reverted back to pre-pandemic routines, people have kind of adjusted their listening behavior to fit, what the trend was before the pandemic. So that's one thing. I think that's why we're seeing a decrease in the total population. I think with the increase that we see with the Black population, which is actually pretty exciting, that, we thought with this wave that we were just going to close the gap. But what we're seeing is that Black listenership just took off and exceeded the total population. And what we see here is a sign that Black listeners and Black creators are just not afraid of entering the podcasting space anymore. I use this analogy all the time, but the podcasting space was almost like a dance floor at a wedding where nobody is dancing until a brave few join in and then everybody else jumps on. So I think that's what's happening with podcasts right now. Black creators are seeing it as a space for, full of opportunity where they can share their opinions, their perspectives, and other creators are following suit. So it's exciting to see. And of course, when you have a lot of content and a lot of creators, the listeners are going to follow. So for a while, we were stuck in this endless loop of we don't have enough content, so we don't have enough listeners, and we don't have enough listeners because we don't have enough content. I think I'm very excited that we have broken through that, and the future is just ripe with opportunity for Black creators and listeners.
Interesting. I love this analogy of the dance floor. Now we want to show the viewers. We want to tell them a little bit more about the people on this dance floor. Who are these Black monthly podcast listeners that are joining? So before we start, I'd like to remind viewers that we'll be highlighting the key findings of the report. We won't show everything today. There are 60 pages that are going to be available at edisonresearch.com. So you can download the full version after this webinar. So first of all, let's take a look at gender. The gender breakdown among monthly podcast listeners is a little bit different compared to, the gender breakdown of the Black monthly podcast listeners is a little bit different compared to the total monthly podcast listening audience. They're more likely to be female. 55% of Black monthly podcast listeners identify as women. Now, something else to note here is that this group has aged since 2021, although 18 to 34-year-olds represent the largest group like it did last year. That aligns well with like the what we see in the composition of the US general podcast audience. Nidia, what do you think this means for listeners and the way the industry is shifting?
What we see here is it's a very interesting fact. I think that for a long time, podcasts were seen almost as like a novelty for like younger people. And what we're noticing is that we're maturing. The space is growing and is offering something for everyone. I think the space is becoming established enough that older listeners are coming in just to find content that they can connect with. So it's just very exciting. I think in some cases, people will think that the audience is aging up, but in this case, what we're seeing is an influx of older listeners coming in as well. So I think overall, advertisers should be paying attention because this is not just a space for one demographic, it's a space for everyone.
Absolutely. Something for everyone, I think also has to include parents and kids. As you said, Nidia, podcast listeners are more likely to be parents. 38% say they have children. And some of these parents revealed to us how many of their children listen, which we'll get to later in the report. In the meantime, let's look at how these monthly listeners are consuming podcasts on their own. So about half of this group, I would say, are in their rookie season. At the time of their survey, 48% of Black podcast consumers say they started listening to the medium less than a year ago. And that's a few points up from 2021. Women are also newer to the medium. Over half started listening in the last year. That's less than half of men say the same. Now, if you take these stats into account, some might expect a higher increase in monthly podcast listening than we saw earlier. But what you have to take into consideration is the churn, right? The rotation. As newer people to podcasting join this dance floor that Nidia mentioned, there are also people who leave. It's good to keep in mind that half of these listeners, though, are new to the podcasting world, and that really factors in to how they discovered podcasts for the first time. And we see that in this stat. Edison has been researching the medium since 2006, and it was once word of mouth that allowed for this idea of podcasting to spread. Today, it's social media. 36% of Black listeners say they discovered podcasts for the first time via social media. That's up 5 points since 2021, and twice the size of Black listeners who say recommendations from friends and family. So this is how they discovered podcasts, but what attracted them to the first podcast that they listened to? Now, the dominant element in this graph might seem like the show's topic, but the remaining choices here, TV, movie celebrity, social media influencer, music artist, that can all be combined into a group. If half were attracted to their first show by the topic, then the other half were attracted by an icon or a celebrity figure. And I'm curious, Alexis, what type of implications does this have when advertisers seek and target audiences?
Yeah, so there are a couple interesting implications we can take from this, right? If we're saying half are attracted from a topic-based situation and the other half being from the actual talent. So what we're seeing a lot in the podcast space, especially with talent, is kind of a new wave of influencers or a new wave of influencer marketing, right? So if we're seeing sort of our more traditional social media-based influencer kind of struggling to maintain that authenticity that attracts their audience, we're really seeing the podcast hosts, the podcast talents really pick up that slack, right? We know that a podcast host kind of has that inbuilt ability to foster a community, to engage with their community, kind of build around it, and are really a trusted voice Yes, sorry, just reading this question. Hi, I'm Alexis. I'm from Mindshare, the comms planner of the team. No problem. So yes, I think they come with kind of that inbuilt credibility that makes it really exciting for an advertiser to come in and think about how we can sort of work with these types or within this type of channel. It also creates kind of two ways in, right? So there is that more traditional like talent-based partnership where you can kind of infuse a brand moment into a podcast via like a host read. That is very popular among kind of the Black podcast listener. I think we get into that a little bit later. Or you can go for kind of a more topic or content-based buy, right? So kind of surrounding your brand around topics that are relevant to the audience that you're seeking. So a lot of juicy stuff from an advertising perspective for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. So there seems to be the listening certainly mirrors the strategy that you form, right? Like you have content, there's topics versus that personality, that host that have that influence. So it's interesting that knowing why Black podcast listeners started listening tells us a lot about how advertisers can best reach them. But knowing why they stopped listening to a show they used to listen to regularly can also tell us a few things. So if we look at this stat, we see and we understand that about a third of Black podcast listeners say they stopped listening to a show they used to listen to. And now this number seems low to you. Just consider how new these listeners are to the medium. Many of them haven't had the chance to stop listening to a podcast yet. I know many of us have probably stopped listening to one that we used to listen to years ago, but Black podcast listeners haven't had that chance. At least this group hasn't. So we can learn a little bit about those who have stopped listening. So if we zoom in on this purple section of this pie, of those who ever stopped listening to a show, 37% say they did so because they got tired of it. 31% say they didn't have any time, or they didn't have the time anymore. Now, while you can't control how much time people have in a day, there are some things that creators can control. And I'll just highlight a few of those here. Oh, actually, not highlighting. So I'll call them out. So 24% say that they stopped listening because the show stopped producing new episodes. 20% say it's because they forgot about the show in between seasons. Now, this is why so many people in the industry preach frequent episode publishing, having this active feed so that listeners can tune in routinely and don't forget about you, especially in a saturated market. It's going to be a key to your podcast, right? To like making sure that you grow your podcast. At the very least, creators should consider, keeping their feed active with previous episodes if they don't have the opportunity to create new episodes. Now, Nidia and Alexis, this anyone can do it aspect of the medium is what makes podcasting. The medium, it's a form of creator-led audio, and we measured how close Black listeners are to this network of creators. It might be closer than you think. 29% of Black listeners say they personally know a friend, relative, or a colleague that produces their own podcast. And these podcasters are influencing listeners. If we zoom in on these 29%, about 2/3 say they regularly listen to a podcast produced by a friend, relative, or colleague. This community is listening to audio produced by someone close to them. But it's, not just audio. We know video and podcasts continue to be debated. Is it a podcast? If it's a video, should I make a video for my podcast? We don't know the answer, but one thing's for sure: consumption of podcasts with video, as reported by the Black audience is trending up. So you can see at the top number, it's up 5 points. Those who watch or listen to a podcast with video that they actively watch while listening. Audio only podcast listening is trending down. Nidia and Alexis. So video seems to be very important to these listeners. And we also know video podcast consumption is higher among Black listeners than the total population. From your perspective, what are the benefits of having a podcast with video?
I can't speak as a creator, but I am sure that a lot of listeners and even younger listeners, they find comfort in seeing the voices that are delivering the content that they're seeking. So a part of it could be the discoverability of the content, the ability to see, there's a BIPOC perspective on this topic. I could see it. Let me tune in. So that could be a factor. Also last year, and this is something we're not really spending a lot of time on this wave, but last year we uncovered that Black listeners are more likely to listen with others. And I think that communal listening behavior is best when it's done with something that can bring people together, like an image or a video. So that could also be a factor. Also, I know that when it comes to the type of content and the type of creators they're gravitating towards, especially younger listeners, these are people that most likely would have already had a platform on a video streaming platform. And naturally that traffic that's coming from there may be going to podcasts. So there's a lot of things playing in when it comes to this particular trend.
Awesome. And then I know for me, from an advertising perspective, I really appreciate having a video component to the podcasting experience. It just lends itself to create a more immersive content experience, right? So we get kind of that audio piece where we can have kind of talent do the host reads, but at the same time, if we have a video component, right, we can kind of surround that video with an additional branded experience, right? Things like banners, click-throughs straight to a website, that kind of thing. And it creates just a little bit more of an engaging experience. So I really enjoy having the video piece to it.
Yeah, it provides that extra experience, like you said, an extra opportunity for advertisers to connect with listeners. So it's interesting. Some things that people don't think of when they consider video in their podcasts. So thanks for that perspective. You touched on BIPOC voices, right? And how important it is for these listeners. And we know that because we've seen a lot of evidence that Black listeners do want to support Black voices. About 2/3 say it's very or somewhat important that the podcasts they listen to include Black stories and perspectives. 62% say it's important that the shows include unfiltered conversations that can't be heard elsewhere, while half say it's important that their shows include Black podcast hosts. Now, this theme that representation matters was very prominent in the 2021 report, and the response from the 2022 survey reinforces this idea. If we want podcast listening to grow in the US, we better pay attention to Black representation in the medium. Here's a list of items that Black listeners agree strongly or somewhat agree would convince them to listen to more podcasts. Over half of Black listeners say they would, go back to this slide. Over half of Black listeners say they would listen to more podcasts if there were more with Black hosts, and 57% say if there were more with Black stories and perspectives. And those are the bottom two items there. There are, of course, other things that the industry has continued to work on, trying to make podcasts more discoverable, making it easier to discover shows. That's at 63% of people who say they would listen more if they were easier to discover. And 71% say if there were more podcasts available on the topics that they're interested in. But if we focus on this theme of representation, we know it's important to listeners because we know that 3/4 of the Black monthly audience say they frequently or occasionally seek out content that focuses on Black stories and perspectives on podcasts already. There seems to be an untapped craving for this content. Alexis and Nidia, would you agree? And what do you think listeners mean by, some of these responses that they're agreeing to?
I mean, I think it's, we've seen in advertising and just in content in general that as humans, we are seeking content that's relatable, experiences that we can see ourselves in. And podcasts really offer a window into that, more so than any other media. I mean, you can have an entire 20-minute episode about a topic that you and your crew are all into and all about. And I think that's what's driving, this desire to see voices, to hear voices like your own and communities that reflect your own as well. I almost see it as, and I think for the broader community, for broader advertising community, it's hard to grasp how relatable and how authentic the conversations that are happening on podcasts are, because of course, like if this is not something that you're interested in, you probably won't listen to. But I almost equate it to a neighborhood or a street that you never walk by, and there's things that happen in that street, like the street I grew up on. There were parties happening. There was I grew up in the Bronx, so the experiences in the Bronx were very different, right? So if you're an advertiser that's not really walking by that street or putting a billboard on that street, then you really won't be seen by that community. Just like this weekend, we had an event with one of the podcasts that we represent at SXM Media. It's called The Read. And that event was just incredible. The amount of engagement, the language, and just how listeners and the creators were seeing eye to eye in everything and all the topics. And that's just something that you wouldn't be able to grasp unless you were a part of that experience. And I think that's why this percentage is so high here. How there's just this constant desire to seek out content that focuses on Black stories and perspectives. And it's beautiful to see.
Very beautifully put. Yeah, that's interesting. So, Alexis, do you want to add anything on this?
I mean, I think she nailed it. That was pretty well put. But yeah, I think to her point, there is definitely a need and an appetite for kind of a more authentic content consumption experience. And I think that's really what this number is pointing to.
Yeah, and this is definitely reflected in the type of content that this audience consumes, right? These ideas, these attitudes, and we'll see that when we look at their listening habits. So when we do look at these listeners' listening habits, we're going to focus in on weekly podcast listeners, so we can make some comparisons to the general population. So although monthly podcast listening is up, though, we do want to explain that weekly podcast listening actually saw a 4-point decrease among Black Americans since 2021. How does that make any sense? I think we'll get some insight in a second, but please don't take this out of context, right? The Black population's decrease in weekly listenership does mirror the decrease among the overall population. Alexis, any perspective that you can add here from the buyer side on the importance of knowing this context? Because a lot of people, I think, will see this and take it out of context.
Yeah, I think one thing to remember, right, this is a 2.0, and I think just in general, Black listenership is fairly new, so it's going to be ever changing, especially at the beginning. It's going to be something that we're going to want to track and look at, because these listeners are still forming a habit, right? And so we're kind of figuring out what that looks like to them, what their content consumption habit is going to look like. So that's one important context. It's what makes podcast really interesting as kind of a test and learn channel, right? You can kind of see what works and what doesn't as this listenership kind of continues to solidify. And also, I think when we look at the types of content they're consuming, it kind of helps to shed a little bit of light on how or why they're listening in the ways that they are.
Gotcha. Yeah. So monthly listening is up, weekly listening is down. one clue as to why. It seems that women are the women boosting the size of Black monthly podcast listeners seem to be falling off when we do isolate those weekly podcast listeners. If we look at the monthly audience, we go back to this monthly audience, listeners in this group are more likely to be women in the Black group versus the overall audience, which skews slightly male. However, when we do drill down on Black weekly listeners, the group begins to skew male. Black listeners, if you look at that on the right, 52% of Black weekly podcast listeners identify in that male group. So there are probably multiple factors here, but Nidia and Alexis, what do you think is happening?
I mean, there's a number of things that are happening here. I think when it comes to the monthly number, the reason why we see Black women leading there is because Black women have historically led a lot of the media trends. If you look at the breakdown of any other medium, women or amongst Black people, women tend to lead the way there. I think the reason why we see a difference between men and women and why men are leading weekly listenership, it's due to the content that they're consuming. We'll get into it a little bit later, but I think a lot of the content that's geared towards women has less of a frequency. Women tend to probably tune in and binge it for a while and then tune in next month and kind of consume all of that great content all at once. I can speak as a woman that that's what I tend to do. I just like consume a ton of content and then I move on to the next thing. And then for men, a lot of the content that men over index against tends to be more weekly or more frequent, more episodic. So I don't want to spoil what's coming next, but you'll get a better perspective when we look at the genres and topics that this audience is consuming.
No, yeah, content certainly has to be a factor. So let's just dig in, right? Let's dig into the content that Black listeners are consuming. Black listening is unique. We know this. And here in this chart, here are some of the ways that listening differs to the total US podcast audience. On the left, 49% of Black listeners consume comedy podcasts, and that's 7 points higher than the total weekly audience on the right. Here, music is 17 points higher among Black listeners. Sports is 6 points higher, and true crime is 7 points lower. Among women weekly listeners, Black women weekly listeners, we know that comedy, music, true crime, and health and fitness take the top four. You do see increases there for true crime since 2021, increases there for TV and movies. But some of the biggest increases occur in that self-care area. A 9-point increase for religion and spirituality. Yes, I'll put that into the self-care area. And the size of Black female listeners reporting personal development, that nearly doubled since 2021. Men are a little bit different, yet they're very similar. Sports and business podcasts don't make up the top 10 topics for women, but they do for men. About half ever listen to sports shows, while 1/3 report ever listening to business shows. But men are similar to women in the sense that comedy and music are found in the top 3, just as they are among women. Now, these are some broad topics that we've measured since 2021. But Nidia, we decided to get a little bit more specific in 2022, didn't we?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been such a shift. I think there was a request just to go back to the female topic. So if we can take a quick look back again.
Oh, yeah.
We can, you mentioned it, right? Like, of course, you're going to have comedy music being among the top 2, the third one being true crime and seeing a little bit more of a lift versus the previous year. We also have TV and movies playing a role, but where you saw the highest shifts was religion and spirituality and personal development. This year, we've seen a huge shift in the conversation when it comes to the Black audience, and then we can go into that slide that we were going to cover. And what we wanted to get into this year, which is different from last year, we didn't ask this question, was what specific topics was this audience consuming in 2022? What were some of the things and what were the podcasts that they were consuming talking about. Self-care was number one, which is, I think we can all attest to the fact that we all need a little bit of self-care after everything we've been through. So it's just great to see that, the Black audience is really taking care of themselves, prioritizing, their own health and wellness over everything else. And I think another interesting thing is that social and racial injustice was number two. I think you can see kind of cause and effect here with, everything that was happening in the past year, and then this desire to take care of yourself kind of going hand in hand. And I don't see this trend going anywhere. I think there's been a shift in the priorities that people have, and the conversation just continues to go into prioritizing oneself.
Yeah, and this was great because we got to see a lot of specific topics that we don't typically cover in other research. So, Nidia, thank you for this great idea, because this certainly came from you. And I think we want to circle back to this idea that representation does matter, because we asked this question: which of the following topics or podcast topics would you be interested in if they primarily included Black stories and perspectives? Now, 3/4 say they would be interested in history. Another 3/4 in news, and the list goes on. Over half are saying they would be interested in any of these, any one of these given topics. If we overlay those who already listen, now we did exclude some from the previous list because we didn't ask about all of them in this question. But if we do overlay this, we say, if we overlay this with people who listen, we see that the 26% say they already listen to history. 30% say they listen to personal finance, right, et cetera. We can identify the gaps in light blue here. This number here represents those who are interested but don't listen. Interested if they primarily included Black stories and perspectives. Now the numbers represent opportunities, and some of the largest opportunities include the 47% who say they do not currently listen to history podcasts, but are interested in Black history podcasts, right? If they included Black stories and perspectives. The 41% say technology, and there's 43% who say kids and family, those who don't listen but are interested in kids and family podcasts. And I always like to say that Generation Z and Generation Alpha are key to helping the industry grow. YouTube is so popular among Gen Z and Gen Alpha because they grew up with it, right? Podcasts can also make its way to that position if you start them off young. And today we know these groups are already tuning in. 41% of Black weekly podcast listeners are parents of children under 17. Over 1/3 of these parents say their children listen to podcasts. Alexis, what do you think the outlook is on kids podcasts, on the advertising side of things? And what does this mean to you? What does this stat mean to you?
Yeah, so a couple interesting things happening here when I look at this. So I think first, as we've seen throughout this deck, just Black listenership is growing in general. So this is going to be something that we're going to want to look at and track over the years to see how it grows and see how it shifts. More interestingly, although I don't know that we'll be able to see this until listener report 3.0, 4.05, is that potentially what could be happening here is that we are building a generation of loyal listeners as they continue to grow up, right? So like kind of what you alluded to when we think about how Gen Z really grew up with the internet, with social media, this new group of children could potentially be growing up with kind of a naturally inbuilt habit of listening to podcasts, which could be interesting as we see them continue to age from an advertising perspective. So really interesting stuff that will be interesting to look at in a couple of years.
Yes, definitely. And it's certainly a key to helping this audience grow. Now, Nidia and Alexis, you know better than I do, advertising is a key form of revenue for podcasters. So let's see how listeners feel about advertising.
Before we jump into that, I did see we had a question, Gabriel, that we may or may not have the answer to around the listenership of children. Did we dig down to see if they were listening specifically to kids' podcasts or co-listening with what their parents, or maybe a combination, likely?
Yeah, we don't have any information on kids' podcasts listening, or what they were listening to, what themes, what topics they were listening to. We just know that these listeners, parents of kids listeners, identified them as listening to podcasts. So no information on what topics they listen to, maybe in the future. And we do not know if they were co-listening with them. So thanks, Alexis, for stopping me there. And I also see another question here, digging down into cities. Will we be covering what cities are consuming the most podcasts? The sample size doesn't allow us to dig deep into different cities. We can look at regions by census, looking at the southern region, or what the census identifies as the southern region of part of the US, Northeast, West, even the Midwest, but we can't really dig into cities or big markets. So let's see. So Nidia, I think Nidia and Alexis, we're going to get into monetization now, looking at how listeners and what they think about advertising in the podcasting space. So continuing with our weekly listeners, we did ask this question as a result of hearing a sponsorship or ad on a podcast that you listen to. Have you ever engaged in these actions? Right. 68% say they've gathered more information about a company or product. 61% say they recommended a product to a friend or family member. So they are already engaging with some of these advertisers based on the podcast ads that they listen to. If we continue, we can see that representation does matter. Let's take a look at how many of the podcasts that they listen to are hosted by Black hosts. Right, there's a good chunk. Sorry, I can't see my screen here. 16% who say they listen to all of them. All of the podcasts that they listen to are hosted by Black podcast hosts, and a third say most of them. 47% say that some of the podcasts that they listen to are already hosted by Black hosts. If we parse this group out and look at how they track with that question that we just saw, have they ever engaged in any of these behaviors? We look at those who have listened to a podcast hosted by Black hosts in the last month. 73% say they've gathered more information. These listeners who have listened to a podcast that was hosted by a Black host are more likely to have engaged in any of these behaviors than those that had never listened to a podcast with a Black host. And even those who have listened to a podcast with a Black host more than a month ago in some areas. So this is one of the reasons why it leads this group to engage with brands more than the US weekly podcast audience. As we can see on this graph here, 68% of Black weekly podcast listeners say they gathered more information about a company or a product, compared with 63% of the US weekly podcast listening audience who say the same. Now, this information from the US weekly podcast audience is from our other study, Edison Podcast Metrics. And that survey was conducted in quarter 3. We took data from quarter 3 to compare it to the Black weekly podcast audience. So we have evidence that Black weekly listeners are more engaged with brands than your ordinary listener or your average listener in the country. All right, so Nidia and Alexis. So that was a bunch of data that we just saw. There's some key findings from the report that we wanted to touch on today. The full report will be available on edisonresearch.com after this webinar. What do you think are your key takeaways? What do you want these viewers today to walk away with?
Yeah, so I can kick us off. I guess the main thing that I take away from the advertising perspective is that the podcast landscape is changing, right? We saw it all across this presentation. We're seeing Black listenership especially enjoy an upward trajectory. And as we see that continue, it creates a lot of opportunities for advertisers to get in there, to test and learn, to adapt to listening habits, and to really just play and have fun and enjoy a level of authenticity and engagement that we're not necessarily seeing in other channels right now. So really, really fun time.
Yeah, another thing that we're seeing too is that this experience, this listening behavior that's happening with podcasts is not in any way a lean back experience. These listeners are leaned in, they're engaged, they're taking action. Not only are they engaging very heavily with the creators and supporting them and pretty much participating in the conversation and taking it further, but they're also engaging with the brands that are a part of this environment. So I think that for any advertiser that has had any doubt or was curious about how else can they connect with this Black audience, I think they don't have to look any further than podcasts in order to do so.
Great way to connect with these listeners. My takeaway is that there is opportunity in representation. So we saw this theme come up in this report, and we saw that Black listeners have a craving for Black stories and perspectives. And we also see how valuable it can be when advertisers decide to connect with these audiences through a representative and a Black host, right? Someone that these listeners trust and someone that these listeners want to support. So I think there is representation, there is opportunity in representation, especially if you're passionate about it. If you want to be in this space, if you're a Black creator, if you're a Black host, go continue doing it, right? Nidia, so this occurred to me when I got your title wrong, right? I think you were a director last year when we did this report, and I called you director this year, but it turns out that you got promoted, right? You're you're vice president now.
I didn't even notice that.
It was in an email, yeah, when we were discussing this. But it just reminded me of how we've been working on this report for a long time. We've worked on other reports that deal with representation, like the Latino Podcast Listener Report, and I'm happy to see that the passion that you have for building this representation in this medium has led you to become a vice president at SXM and helping with selling advertisements. It's done the same for me, right? The passion that I have for helping the representation in the medium, for providing these statistics, it's led me to become a senior director of research at Edison Research. So I think it could do the same for others in the podcasting space. Keep doing your thing, and if you're passionate about it, I think good things will come. So now we're going to take some questions, Nidia and Alexis. We're looking at the Q&A box here. We have a couple questions from Brittany, Walter, Hayden. Brittany asks, does the increase of video podcasts impact Black consumption as well? Okay. Anyone, Nidia or Alexis, do you want to take that one?
I think historically we've seen them go hand in hand. I think as we see streaming and podcast listenership go up and creators using video as a way to reach out to more audiences, we see that growing as well. I think it'll be interesting just to see the trajectory that they both take. Year after year, we're seeing video being a very important component of the listening experience for a lot of listeners. And so I don't see that going anywhere. I think that creators are using it as another tool in their toolkit, and how to connect and engage with people further. So I think that they have a correlation, and they've always had a correlation. So it's interesting just to see where it's going from here.
Okay, another question. Walter asks, does the Black Monthly Podcast listener data account for YouTube or just the audio platforms? No, so it does account for YouTube. Black listeners did report listening to podcasts on YouTube. It does not matter whether it was just video or audio. As we saw, Black podcast listeners do consume podcasts with video, and much of that does come from YouTube. So yes, this does include YouTube listening. Okay. All right, I'm going to go down to the bottom of the list. So Hayden asks, is there a length of podcast that does better? And then for video podcasts, is it full episodes or clips from full episodes? All right, so I feel like we always get that question. Now I'm curious, Nidia or Alexis, what is your opinion?
I think we asked that question. I don't think we covered it right now on the webinar, but I think we did ask and go a little bit deeper into what type of content they're consuming and how they're consuming the podcast, whether it's a clip or a full episode. I think we can, when we release the full version of the study, you'll be able to find the answer. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I think that you'll find the answer there. And Gabe, if you do remember it, I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, no, we don't have too much on the length of a podcast, but when it comes to clips or full episodes, I always like to say that clips are a good way to promote your podcast, especially when we consider some of the big platforms out there that are currently influencing content, or what content is in front of your eyes. Consider TikTok or even YouTube Shorts. Using clips of your show will definitely help, I think, with promotion and helping your podcast become more discoverable. When it comes to full episodes, I think we also know that people tune in for a very long time. So the podcast length is not going to be an easy, like this umbrella or this blanket answer for every single podcast. It depends on your genre, it depends on the topic. Okay, let's do one more and then we'll get to some closing remarks. Okay. So Stephen Worthy asks, we've always seen a direct correlation between downloads and ad revenue. I feel the download metric is elusive. Will downloads continue to be the gold standard for podcast success? Any outlook, any perspective from the buyer side, Alexis?
I would say my favorite answer, which is not necessarily, or it shouldn't be, right? It should always depend on the objective of your campaign, right? Sometimes we want to attach ourselves to a podcast or a piece of content to expand reach, right? To expand visits to a website. I don't think tying it specifically to buys or downloads is the correct metric we want to attach ourselves to in every campaign. But again, that deeply depends on what the objective is and what the overall media mix is, right? When we start adding things in addition to audio, right? Different channels work for different objectives. So I think it just depends on what we're trying to do for each campaign. I know that's a very vague-ish answer, but it should definitely depend campaign by campaign.
Gotcha. Well, it's good to hear that buyers are taking a look at this on an individual basis, right? Case by case. And Edison is hard at work at helping with some of these metrics. The download isn't always the most trustworthy. It's not always the most efficient. And a lot of our research is based on survey and asking listeners whether they listen to a specific show. We have a lot of information on that through Edison podcast metrics, but we're continuing to find solutions and ways to satisfy that sort of need in the industry. So keep an eye out for, stay connected with us, subscribe to our insights letter. We do have information that will be coming out this year on any solutions or any sort of accomplishments that or any strides that we make to fill those needs. So Nidia and Alexis, thank you so much for this time today. And thank you to your companies, SXM Media and Mindshare, for making this report possible. Without them, this data would not be available on edisonresearch.com. Thank you, viewers, for attending. The full report will be available on edisonresearch.com. Like I said, we also will have a webinar next week, Infinite Dial. You can use this QR code to see what the status update is on podcast listening in the country. So you take a picture, use the QR code, use the QR code to register. You don't want to miss that. Laura, I know we're going to randomly select a winner for the Edison sweater. In the meantime, Nidia and Alexis, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, thank you so much, Gabe. You've been an amazing partner in helping us get, this second wave out in market. I think that this type of work really validates the importance of what we do in the media landscape. I think that breaking barriers when it comes to Black listeners is absolutely important. And I think from now on, advertisers just need to continue to support Black creators. They're driving not only their business, but they're also really changing the conversation and what the landscape looks like. So I'm excited for more of these reports. I'm excited about the engagement that we constantly get around this type of content. And I just hope that this report makes a difference for a lot of the creators that have tuned in and helps them evolve the way that they speak. Or the way that they are supported in the advertising space. So thank you for working with us on this. And thank you to Mindshare. You guys have been amazing partners in helping us get this report in front of everyone.
Yeah, I think on my end, in addition to everyone who joined us today, thank you also to you, Nidia and Gabriel. This was my first year on this project. And like I said at the top, the best part of my job is the audience work, the research, the deep dives. So it was really exciting for me to be a part of this and excited to see how the channel grows within this audience for the next years to come.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you to the both of you again for lending your voice. This wouldn't be possible without you. Now we do want to give away the sweater, Laura. If we want to, Laura's behind the scenes. Do we want to announce that?
Yes, so our sweatshirt winner today is Jessica Altman. Sorry if I mispronounced that. We have your information. We'll contact you to get in touch with how we'll get it out to you.
Awesome. Congratulations, Jessica. All right. Please enjoy the rest of your day and stay in touch. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.